Yeah, I jumped on the UK Furries Overseas panel
Mm-hmm.
just to mention that the first furry party hosted by U.S. fans in the UK was in 1987 Worldcon
Okay, yeah, yeah, yeah.
at a B&B that was about 10 blocks down from where the convention was.
That's pretty cool. Alright, let's see if this works. There we go. Actually, I should probably announce on the Discord server that this is actually up, even though it's just a little bit early. Alright, cool, cool. And let me double check this is the right link that they're giving, because someone did post it on there. Yep, that is. Cool. Awesome. That means it's working. Oh my god, it's working. What that means I can do, in the meantime, while we're waiting, since we're not starting for like another 10 minutes.
Oh shit. What's the matter? Yeah.
Should I make a grand entrance?
Gee, how did you guess?
Hey everybody, we'll be starting the stream officially in about 10 minutes or so. I'll just be playing a little bit of actual archival footage from about 1988 in the meantime, so take a look.
Cheer, man!
The rest of the gang race against each other to bump and collect the reward. Checks. Are you ready? Don't leave us. Just a minute.
So just for some context, what you're seeing right now is a rune party at a science fiction convention in 1988. And all these people are technically furry fans, and they're all watching just... Actually, an animated spoof right now on Charlie Brown, which is really popular at that time. But if you happen to know kind of about some people who were big players at this point in furry history, like late 80s, early 90s, you actually recognize a whole bunch of them in this shot. Like Fred Patton by the wall reading the book. Like the one behind the camera in this instance right now is Mark Merlino, who'd actually, he and Rod O'Reilly would start the first furry convention in 1989. But like I said, this is just a little bit before that. And so they're walking around with one of the first fursuiters, Hilda. Basically kind of like a Bambioid character based on Disney's Bambi, but made into like an actual anthro character.
Well, there are a few other people who are interested, Alex. That's why I'm asking.
Let's see, we got 22 so far. That's pretty good.
Very good.
But yeah, if you actually listen to what people are saying as Hilda is walking around, a lot of them are like, whoa, that's really cool. Yeah, no, this is like one of, if not the first fursuiter. Yeah, the guy playing the character, his name's Robert Hill. He passed away a couple years ago, and he actually worked at Disney for a while. You know, as a, playing the characters and all that sort of thing. So he learned how to make costumes, hence why he has the character. Yeah, I think the video is lagging a little bit. My internet's been kind of slow recently, unfortunately. No, yeah, it was definitely kind of a weird thing for people to see just out of nowhere. Because again, this is a science fiction convention, which those and Comic Cons were like the only conventions around in the 80s and before. So this is just kind of where people, like early furries, were hanging out, more or less. This is just where you went.
Why do I recognize Bambi? What's your name? Bambi always.
Yeah, like right here, the people actually recognize the character. You know, they know who this is from comics. Because this is actually based off a character that someone else drew. No, yeah, it's definitely weird to think about because, I mean, especially for a lot of us. Oh, watching videos seem premature. I'm gonna keep this panel PG, but we are going to mention some things like, oh yeah, some part of furry history is that part of it was people kind of recognizing their own like sexuality. For example, like figuring like, oh yeah, I am gay or bi or something like that, because that was a big thing that happened in furry fandom, especially in the 90s, with a whole bunch of new people who eventually would show up. So, kind of, but we're not going to get too into detail.
You got enough.
Isn't that enough? Yes.
Thank you. I needed it. Now that, I loved it.
But anyway, I was saying, like, yeah, it's really kind of cool to see stuff this old because, yeah, it's a lot of us have not been around that long, and so just seeing that, like, yeah, people have been doing this for a while is really cool to see. The concept of anthropomorphic characters goes back to Egypt, but the context for like furry fandom is it's not nearly as old. You're talking like the last 70 years really is when you start kind of seeing the process form. Because you have to keep it in context like, oh yeah, this is fan culture we're talking about. And fan culture has only been around since like really the 20s, which again is a long time, but it took like the things like, you know, mass media, newspapers, you know, readily available books, and like, I don't know, Pulp Fiction, you know, just stuff that's really easy to find that really kind of helped fandom make fandom a thing. Oh yeah, definitely. I mean, that was part of this particular character's design. Well, the guys seem to like it, obviously. Alrighty, we can probably move on to the actual, well, the actual panel real quick. If you do want to check out this video and a whole bunch of others that are recorded about this time, you can go to the Prancing Scale Terrors YouTube page, and they have a whole bunch of other stuff just like this, so I would definitely give that a look. Alright. We've got a couple more minutes. You still there, Sai? Oh, not sure if I can hear you or not. Oh, there you are.
Yeah, I'm here. Your audio was cutting out, and then it went away. I guess you muted it so you could talk on the...
Oh, I didn't mute it. That's weird.
Okay.
Huh, must have just been my internet because I was trying to stream a video and like a stream at the same time. Cool. All right. Well, I think it's working out right now, and they should be able to hear you, by the way. All right, cool. I think, yeah, I started the stream just a little bit early to make sure it's all working properly. But it is 10:30 already, so I think we can go ahead and get started with this panel. Thank you all very much for showing up. I'm Dox. I am actually a history student at the University of Nebraska-Lincoln, and I actually wrote an entire research paper on the history of furry fandom, specifically why we have such a large LGBT component, for actual college credit, which was really cool to do, So I've actually been doing this sort of thing for about a year now, this official project. So I've actually been able to do a lot of research, talk to a whole bunch of different people, both online and at cons. So this has been a big work in progress. I can't thank the people who've worked with me enough. And that includes someone who's in the call with me right now, and hopefully you'll be able to hear him right now. This is Mark Merlino, who is one of the early people involved with furry fandom back in the 1980s, and a little bit earlier as well. Hey.
Hello from the Prancing Skill Chair.
Can you all hear him all right? Hopefully that works out. I think the stream is just a little bit behind, so I want to make sure they actually do hear you. Cool. Haven't heard anything yet. Yes. Okay, cool. They are hearing you. That's good. All right, awesome. So, I should mention right off the bat that the first half of this panel might seem a bit strange because there won't be much on furry fandom directly at first. However, it's all relevant and extremely important to know and understand in order to understand the whys and hows of our own fandom, so stick with me for a bit. All right, here we go. I wanted to start off with a bit of a side note. The whole reason why I started this project in the first place was because Fred Patton, who was a renowned furry fan, died back in December of 2018. Fred wasn't the most visible fan, but he was unparalleled in the sheer amount of stuff that he was always doing. He was a fan his whole life. He joined the Los Angeles Science Fiction Society in 1960, was a part of comics fandom since its inception in the early 60s, and, together with Mark Merlino, he helped introduce fans to anime in the 70s. These two were crazy about the stuff, so it only makes sense that they started the first ever anime club in the United States. Fred also became the editor of the furry fanzine Rawbrazzle in 1989, which was often the zine passed around at room parties, and was how a lot of the earliest people found the fandom in the first place. He was active in all these things because they mattered to him, which is why he helped writing a history of furry fandom, but he couldn't because of a stroke in 2005. So that's why I'm doing this, because it matters to me, and after all, somebody's got to do it, right? But why does this matter? What should we be learning from our history anyway? Part of it is helping us understand the power of identity and self-expression, but also how exactly we got to a point where we can have a talking animal represent us, among other things. If you've been at fandom long enough, aka since the 90s, you probably already know at least some of what I'm talking about. To be brief, during the 1990s, there was a big debate between fans on what furry fandom was supposed to look like. On one end, you had people who were longtime con-goers, before fur cons became a thing, and saw fandom as a social space for fans of classic animation, comics, books, and anything anthropomorphic, or even as a jumping-off point for aspiring artists or animators. This mindset was shared by the majority of fans in other fandoms, since these folks found fandom through cons, zines, and the like. It was simply how it had always been done. Alright, here we go. On the other end, you had a new crowd who didn't start in fandom at cons, but instead the new online spaces like Furry Muck, which was an online, real-time roleplay service based on Dungeons & Dragons, but without the combat. Not only were these people different demographically, since they were much younger than the old guard, they are also significantly more likely to identify as LGBTQ. Why was that? Because in online roleplay environments, you can be any species or any gender or have any personality or sexual orientation. However the user wanted to present themselves, the anonymity and inherent creativity of online environments let them explore their sexualities or gender identities without significant prejudice, which, especially in the 90s, was a rarity. As you can tell, this attitude was quite different from that of most of the regulars. So when word got out among the online crowd that Conference, the main FurCon at the time, was a thing, they started showing up in significant numbers. For a lot of people, this was the first time they could meet their friends, or in some cases their significant others, in person. It sure as hell beat meeting in a gay bar. Some of the old-timers, as well as new people to fandom, weren't happy about this sudden intrusion, though. In fact, they complained pretty loudly. Accusations range from inappropriate or overly sexual behavior in the con space to a perceived increase in erotic art. Some people even believe that the organizers of the conference were deliberately advertising to LGBT magazines, though that's been pretty thoroughly debunked. The point, though, is that there was a fundamental disagreement over what role fur fandom was supposed to serve, including what sort of behavior was acceptable, or even if behavior had anything to do with being a fan at all. That's just one big example of our history. But why did we get into this situation in the first place? Why did furries end up being the one with a large population of LGBTQ people and not other fandoms? And, more importantly, how does that affect us today? This is where we can really dig into things, because to get into to get how self-expression in furry fandom works, you gotta understand how fandom works, and a bit about gender studies. What even is fandom anyway? Like, if you had to give it a definition, what would that even look like? Well, if there's ever a published fan dictionary, you'd probably end up with something like this. Fandom is a participatory social group centered around a common point of interest, generally some form of mass media. So, in other words, it's a group of people who like the same stuff, usually from books, movies, TV, or comics, and that are usually socially active among each other. That's fandom. I should be clear, though, since you don't have to be in fandom to be a fan of a thing, but to keep things simple, whenever I mention fans, I'm talking about people who are present and active participants in this social microcosm. After all, engagement is what truly defines the culture of fandom. As opposed to being only a consumer of a product, fans are producers of content for each other that's about their shared topic. Until quite recently, basically before the internet took over, the easiest way to keep in touch with large amounts of people at once was with fan magazines, or just fanzines for short. They were essentially acting as analog forums, where you'd submit enough copies of your content for everyone to a central editor who would collate or put together all the copies that were sent and then mail out the complete zines to everyone on the list. Also, until quite recently, photocopying was really freaking expensive. So the de facto way of getting stuff printed for cheap was with something called a mimeograph, which is what you see in the GIF. You can think of it as like a manually operated printer that you make stencils for. Then make as many copies as you needed, usually enough for your friends or anyone else that seemed remotely interested. Cons, clubs, and zines were the ways fans met prior to online communications, but regardless of which medium they were using, fans were creating a separate space for other people like them. It doesn't really matter what exactly fans do, write, draw, collect, discuss, whatever. These are all fan activities, or in fan speak, fanac. At the center of any fanac is the topic at hand, something that fans hold up as praiseworthy or valuable. To take a quote from an actual scholar on fandom, because fan studies is a thing, by the way, named Henry Jenkins, fans, quote, cease to be simply an audience for popular texts. Instead, they become active participants in the construction and circulation of textual meanings. That's a more specific way of describing the kind of engagement fans have and what sets us apart. In fact, Jenkins also said that because we value our fan interests as much, if not more than, say, Shakespeare, we end up crossing a sort of cultural boundary. By putting popular texts, things are seen as works of the masses on the same level as classic works. Fans are viewed by a lot of people as dumb, misguided, or obsessive over quote-unquote trifling works of no real merit. And that, my friends, is what we call othering. Almost by definition, fans aren't put in the same box as other people, and frankly, most fans feel the same way. In all reality, I recognize I mispronounced GIF or GIF. I'm sorry. It's a habit thing. Anyway, in all reality, the development of the term fan as an identity started out with the very first fandom in the 1930s, science fiction. These people knew that they were outside of the norm for liking what most people considered trashy literature, but they embraced that. They were nonconformist in that they weren't trying to change society, but more so that they cared about what they were doing more than conforming to stuff liked by the quote-unquote mundanes, as they called non-fans. It's basically the old word for normies. You could also see that nonconformity in their social attitudes, like how a highly influential group called the Futurians had a decent number of their members involved in the Communist Party USA. Looks like furries aren't the only fans advocating for socialism, huh? In any case, fans started getting in on that one of us attitude, which creates a real sense of community and belonging. Fans wanted to take a break from the mundane part of their lives and just talk with others about their common interest. This was their outlet, their place, their people. So self-expression always played a major role for fans, whether in the physical space of cons like Worldcon, or the World Science Fiction Convention, or in the written space of zines. If you're familiar at all with queer history a bit, you'll know that the idea of creating a space was how gay and lesbian communities formed even during a period where they couldn't be open about their sexuality. Gay bars, the meat trucks, the docks, motel rooms, these were their spaces, since they had nowhere else to express. The difference between these two communities was in the potential risk of being out. Fans at worst faced ridicule, while LGBT folk faced the risk of being killed. But you can see the similarities in their experiences, and while there's unfortunately very little documentation or testimony on LGBTQ fans during most of the 20th century, it's likely that they were at least present at fandoms from the 50s onward. Okay, so while self-expression is well and good, it turns out that just like larger society, we're humans, fans ended up with a sense of what kind of fanac was more legit than others. Thanks to paperback novels becoming a thing in the 50s, you not only had a large amount of new science fiction on the market, but also a number of fans that were able to go pro and publish their work. Ray Bradbury was one of those people. But since the best writers entered the professional market, that meant the only people left to publish their stuff in fanzines were amateurs. And since the editors didn't want crap in their zines, they refused to publish it. The same went for topics as well, since comics and their fans were also becoming widespread. SF fans were reading literature to analyze and discuss, while comics fans were both readers and collectors, anywhere from casual to serious. But since the medium was different, the die-hard lit people looked at comics and were like, this isn't the real thing. Ah. This is related to another debate that had been, and will continue to be, a recurring theme throughout fan history. The two ends of the fanac spectrum known as fandom is a way of life, or fiawal, and fandom is just a goddamn hobby, or fidjag. They're both extremes of how fans perceive their own role in fandom, and in reality, most people fall in the middle and lean one way or another. While the argument over what makes a real fan, quote-unquote, isn't the most serious issue out there, it does flare up whenever a group split occurs. The whole argument sure didn't stop people from liking whenever they wanted, though. And you had plenty of SF fans in the 60s that watched TV just like the rest of the US. Television became the big thing in the 60s, and shows like The Twilight Zone and The Outer Limits were watched religiously by some people. Funny enough, it was one show in particular that changed the direction of fandom as we know it. You know what I'm all talking about. The Man from U.N.C.L.E. Don't worry, I'll get to Star Trek in a second. The main reason why U.N.C.L.E. became such a big deal was because their characters were hot, sexy, badass. This was the same age as Beatlemania, and people were going nuts over hot dudes. So you can think of this as like the origin point of fans swooning over hot dudes. Like, kind of Tumblr attitude, but, you know, I say that very tongue-in-cheek. But remember, this is the 60s we're talking about here, where almost no one talked openly about sex. Shows like this were actively pushing the boundaries of what you could show on television. So it makes sense, then, that Star Trek was the next logical step. Just after its start in 1966, it got huge traction at Worldcon, where it showed on repeat for the whole weekend. And here's the kicker. Because more people were watching Trek than reading science fiction, I mean, because it's TV versus reading, that introduced an entirely new demographic of people to the genre. The most influential among them were young, college-educated women. They loved how Trek focused on a triage of characters, Kirk, Spock, and McCoy, and more importantly, how it put an emphasis on their relationship with others and among themselves. Uncle was the spark, but Trek was the flame. Is there anything you would want to add real quick, Sai? Oh, see if I lost you or not. Oh no, is Discord being crap again? I think it might be. Oh man. That's unfortunate. Hopefully it'll be working by the time I actually get to the end of this panel. I was going to have it so Sai could actually interject a little bit, because, I mean, he's one of the people who actually lived through a lot of this stuff, so. But we can always have a Q&A at the end, and maybe that would work better, but we'll see. Once again, though, to talk about Trek versus SF, it's a big difference compared to the literary SF people, especially when you think about how prior to this point, the vast majority of SF fans were men. The fact that women, young women in particular, came to make up the large majority of Trek fandom really shows in what kind of fan act they did. Fanfiction was reinvented to the definition it had now, because prior to this, fanfiction was just anything amateur written. Now, it was officially known as derivative work. Fan art started as sketches of stills from the show, but then grew into its own thing. And the focus of these fans was almost entirely on this show and or another, as opposed to the entire genre of SF. This intellectual product or brand approach to fandom is more or less the standard today, and you can trace those origins back to Trek. Oh, here we go. Well, you can't really say that these two groups hated each other's guts. I mean, it's rarely the case that entire fandoms hate each other. There was some animosity, especially since media fans, quote-unquote, as they were called, started to outnumber the literature fans. It was enough to where the Trek people decided they needed their own fan space, physical and written. So, they started their own fanzines, migrated to smaller cons beyond Worldcon, and eventually started their own conventions. And based on the data from the time, something like 90% of the most active Trek fans at cons were women 21 and over by the mid-70s. So, I mentioned sex appeal a bit earlier. What does that have to do with anything? I mean, you might giggle at that, but it's a legitimate question, since prior to this point, it just wasn't really an overt thing in fandom. Well, here's the thing. Remember that the stuff media fans create are mostly derivative. If you're writing Trek fiction, it better have the characters you can at least recognize. It's also stuff that's made for other fans who not only get any references you make, but are pretty much the only ones interested in this kind of writing to begin with. This isn't such a big deal if you're writing your own science fiction, since that at least had a general audience by the 70s. But if you're writing Star Trek fanfic, or even manage to get something published, you're pretty much stuck with the group you have. We also have this new demographic of young women who bring new ideas on sexuality to the forefront. The young adults of the 1970s did two things way more than the previous generation: have premarital sex and tolerate LGBT people. This is particularly so for these young women, in no small part due to their campus exposure to second-wave feminism, aka not just suffrage, but equal wages, reproductive rights, and of course, sexuality. And it's this mindset that shines through in various Trek fanzines. In response to publishing stories in their zines with sex scenes, the two women who were the editors replied, quote, "The recurrence of the theme of sex isn't surprising. Sex is a recurrent theme of life." It really shouldn't come as any surprise that Slash came out of this same field once you know the background. For those of you unfamiliar, Slash fiction comes from the shorthand writers use for Kirk/Spock, written shorthand as K/S. The slash originally meant any sort of relationship, that's what the slash stood for, but over time came to stand for sexual relationships, usually between same-sex characters. The whole thing came to represent a rift between different kinds of Trek fans, and in polite conversation, they called the idea of a gay relationship between Kirk and Spock the premise, which is a wonderfully euphemistic way of putting it. It was a way to avoid tackling the fact that media fandom and the sexual revolution were becoming intertwined to a degree that SF fandom hadn't reached yet. Here's a good quote from Paula Smith, a prominent Trek fan and writer at the time, about the whole situation. The quote, "Because the majority of editors of Star Trek fanzines in 1975 were science fiction fans, I was unaware of the ever-increasing number of Star Trek fans who had no experience with science fiction and no interest in science fiction whatsoever. Many of these fans did not view Star Trek as a science fiction program. They saw it as a buddy show or as a heroic romantic saga in which Kirk and Spock were the focus. When these Star Trek fans wrote stories, they wrote about what they thought was most important about Star Trek, Kirk's and Spock's friendship. This is what women brought to fandom in spades." That sure didn't stop Trek fans at the time from having a flame war over it, though. At a TrekCon in '77, Mary Lou Dodge and a vocal minority expressed their extreme distaste with erotic art being present in the art show, describing the whole affair as a, quote, pornography con. Much of her distaste came from her disapproval of homosexuality, and said in a public letter that, quote, "somebody owes a big apology to the real Star Trek fans," end quote. Once again, the idea of what kind of fan act is superior comes up, or specifically, in this case, what kind is appropriate. It probably goes without saying, but adult artwork wasn't the main focus of the con at all. Rather, the presence of adult artwork, even the homoerotic kind, was acceptable. Most people didn't even comment on it. Ironically, the debate was loud enough to make more people aware of Slash. And it got to the point that future cons wisely put out age statements and warnings, but it ultimately led to the myth that Slash fiction made up a far bigger portion of Trek fandom than it actually does. And of course, what was erotic romance to one is pornography to another, especially in an age where sodomy was punishable by prison time, something that was used to incarcerate gay men in particular. In 1970, it was illegal in every state except Illinois. But even by 1980, it was criminal in 29 states, and it was only in a Supreme Court case in 2003 that would lift it nationwide. Even with the rapidly changing attitudes on sexuality thanks to counterculture and events like the Stonewall Uprising in 1969, being gay, which was how anything related to LGBT was referred to for a long time, was still associated with sexual deviancy in the minds of many. But in the minds of the young female Trek fans, that could have been any further from the truth. All right, so that's a lot of background, I understand. But it really is necessary to have this context to understand how we got a furry fandom. You don't have to go back far to learn about the history of what we used to call funny animal fandom, because it didn't really exist until the early 70s. Before that, the closest thing you had to that was Kappa Alpha, which was a comic collecting group started by the founder of comics fandom, Jerry Bales, back in 1964. Just to clarify, because most people today aren't familiar, an Amateur Press Association, or an APA, is essentially a private club with their own bulletin board, which was called an APAzine. Usually, APAs are divided into specific topics, and most were just text with maybe a few illustrations or photocopies when they could be afforded. So, in 1971, Fred Patton was administering Kappa Alpha, and in that same group, you had a guy called Ken Fletcher. He was from Minneapolis and grew up reading the Disney comics created by Carl Barks and the comic strip Pogo by Walt Kelly, both featuring cartoon animals. That's not even mentioning Mad Magazine, which was like the cool kid magazine with biting humor and satire. It was adult, unashamed, and very funny. So it has influenced a lot of these early people's humor. But the problem in Kappa Alpha was that most people were interested in superheroes, and that's it. If you liked underground comics like Robert Crumb's Fritz the Cat, or comics from Europe, or even Japan, you only had about 5 other people in the group who would even admit that they liked the stuff. So Ken, as a cartoonist, wanted to get a group of artists together who would all appreciate the in-jokes and style of underground comics, among other things. He was already involved with a local cartoonist group in Minneapolis, which is where he knew his compatriot Reed Waller from. And together, they would start their own APA in February of 1976 called Foodie. It was labeled as a funny animal APA, but it was more so for cartoonists who just wanted to get away from the plethora of superhero APAs and band together. But note one little detail. All of these people were artists. So even though Fred was a funny animal fan, he couldn't join because he wasn't an artist. That already set it apart from pretty much every other APA of the time, because the rest of them were mostly text. But here, it was focused on people providing their own unique artwork. The submission to Voodoo that ended up making history was Reed Waller's response to Tarl Wayne, a prolific fanzine artist from Toronto. I've actually talked with Tarl quite a bit. Tarl sent a postcard around the beginning of 1978 to Voodoo's headquarters, which was just Ken's house, that just said this: "There was not enough sex in funny animal comics." And Reed was like, "Hold up, we gotta fix this. Hang on a sec." And in the next distribution of Voodoo, he had drawn up a 2-page story of funny animal sex. And one of the characters in there went on to become the titular character of his published erotic comic, Omaha the Cat Dancer. Yes, what started off as a gag became one of the most influential comics of Furry Fandom's genesis, a soap opera starring a stripper. I can't make this stuff up. It's awesome. Yep, notice the name Dennis Kitchen. That's an important one. But the whole point was this. Funny animals were characters that could be used to tell an adult story. Not necessarily an erotic one, an adult one made for adults to read. Not everyone in Voodoo agreed to the point of erotic content, but a lot of people believe that the funny animal genre was worthy of serious merit. Yes, it was very much a hold my beer comment on on Reed's part. You know who else thought the same thing? Outside of this group, an artist named Farah Shimbo. She was coming from Trek fandom, but she wanted to take things in her own direction, going from Trek fanfic in the 70s to a massive 188-page anthology zine called Snow on the Moon, which she compiled in 1978. And her universe was entirely original, tossing away the Trek influences in favor of her own universe of talking animal characters. Guess who read her work? Fred Patton. Not only Fred, but a friend of his named Mark Merlino. Both of them were already highly active in SF fandom in the LA area, but Mark in particular had been showing off tapes he traded with fans in Hawaii, who received Japanese broadcasts of something still relatively unknown to most Americans: anime. So around 1975-76, you had a guy going around science fiction cons showing people Yusha Raiden, like OG robot anime, and people were like, "This is the best thing ever, oh my god." So by May of 1977 specifically, there was enough interest in anime where Mark and Fred started the Cartoon Fantasy Organization, the first anime club in the US where people met regularly in a clubhouse to hang out and watch anime. You still there, Sai?
Yes, I'm here. Can you hear me?
Yep, I can hear you now. You were gone for a second. I tried reaching out for you. Is there anything you want to bring up real quick?
Yes, I was always a huge fan of animation. And in the 1970s, animation being produced was not that good. Disney was into its... Disney had passed away. The Disney films were much more limited animation. The stories were a little weaker. Even Robin Hood weren't up to the quality people had expected from movies like Pinocchio and Bambi.
Mm-hmm.
And Saturday morning television was extremely limited, same old stories over and over again. And essentially animation was kind of dying. Then we start seeing the stuff from Japan originally broadcast on ethnic channels, networks on UHF TV. So the people who knew how to get the UHF channels to work were seeing these subtitled, relatively recent shows from Japan made on the same budget as our Saturday morning shows, but so much richer in content, better writing, better character development, and just a whole overall better look. So when I found out that my friend Wendell Warsher was recording these on Studio U-matic 3/4-inch video cassettes, I borrowed a bunch of the cassettes and took them to a LOSCon, which is the Los Angeles Science Fantasy Society's convention. And I showed them in a room party, and people went crazy for them. So at that point, Fred Patton said, why don't we start doing screenings at the Lossless Clubhouse? Because basically the club had its own permanent clubhouse back then. So we started having screenings there, and then in 1977, Fred, myself, Wendell Warsher, who had the original tapes, Judy Niver, who was an animator that liked the stuff a lot, formed the Cartoon Fantasy Organization, and we had screenings in Los Angeles, originally at the Lossless Clubhouse, and then when Lossless had scheduling problems, we moved to the actual Union Hall of the Animators Union, which was part of the Teamsters Union.
Mm-hmm.
And there, a lot of people who were in the industry would show up because it was their clubhouse and notice the screening was going on and sit down and watch stuff that they had no experience with before. And I think that may have seeded the interest in anime in the professional animation field. One of the members back then went on to create the show Aeon Flux. That was Peter Chung. So he went on from being just, a person in the audience at CFO to becoming a producer and designer and animator on his own really edgy science fiction female bounty hunter show.
Nice. Now that's really cool. Damn.
Or anime-like shows being created in the United States.
Mm-hmm.
And a lot of the first companies that actually made arrangements to distribute anime in this country were CF. Basically, it was a garage operation for a lot of these people.
Mm-hmm.
The Japanese studios were willing to sell the rights to their material per tape without any large amount of money up front. So that it created, this burgeoning cottage industry of selling anime years before big companies caught on that it was actually popular. This is also why you suddenly could buy manga in U.S. bookstores.
Mm-hmm.
So, yeah, it was very important to spread this. It turned out that a lot of the people who were in chapters, both Los Angeles, New York City, San Antonio, Texas, Chicago, were also funny animal fans. Mm-hmm. They also loved cartooning and they loved animal characters. So lots of the club mascots, starting with my skill terror critter, Fanta, and then everybody else would make their own either anime-based or animal-based mascots.
Mm-hmm.
And that's how I met Ken Sample, who was in a New York CFO chapter. And that's how we started trading artwork. And it was his artwork and other artists that we showed off at the first furry parties.
Yes, and we'll get to those furry parties in just a second. So we'll go ahead and do that in a second. All right. Yeah, in fact, if you look at this poster right here, if you look at this character right here, that's Fanta, which is the character that's the mascot of the organization. So you can already start to see this kind of influences. I don't have time to show this right now, but you should all watch this video here. It's nothing too crazy. It's literally just footage of a CFO meeting. But if you look at the closely in the video, you see a couple of shots of what look like furry characters. So even at 1982, you could start to see the patterns arise. All right, let's see where I am. Oh, right. Okay, so we've just started anime fandom. Nice. What's next? Well, it turns out that a decent number of people in the club, unsurprisingly, were interested in more than just Japanese animation. Plenty of them were fans of American cartoons, notably things like Terry Toons, Top Cat, Looney Tunes, anything Warner Brothers, really. Not to mention films like Watership Down. And a pattern showed up of people liking cartoon animal characters. How about that? So, what brought an anime club and an underground comics influenced APA together? In comes Steve Galacci. You can honestly call it a happy accident. This is what he told me himself, back in Anthrocon 2019. This guy was just getting out of the Air Force as a graphic specialist, drawing up diagrams and slides for whatever presentation needed to be done in a given week. But on the side, he was an avid reader of underground and independent comics, not to mention science fiction. It's no wonder that when he saw Star Wars in 1977, like a lot of people, that he was inspired to make something of his own. He had already been doodling animal mascots for the various presentations he was responsible for, so he started designing the animal characters, ships, and universe that would eventually become his own comic series. But until then, he had no idea what he was going to do other than be a science fiction illustrator. But his future would become pretty clear after he was discharged in 1980, since he went to the next WorldCon that year, around Labor Day. He was ready to show off his stuff. And the art show, he submitted a particular piece of a particular feline in a jumpsuit in front of a fighter jet. Very quickly, some of the attendees, such as Ken Fletcher and Tara Wayne, but even some of the CFO people, caught wind of Galacci's art and his notes on a story he was formulating about bioengineered animals. So naturally, they all said, we need to keep in touch. And any time a large enough number of them were at a given con, this mishmash of different fans, comics, SF, fantasy, animation, even tabletop gaming to some extent, these people discussed and sketched anthro characters in all these different genres. Already, we can see some differences with this group as opposed to the, I say traditional, but I really mean more common fan groups. Most of these funny animal fans in the early 80s, again, like I've said, were artists, cartoonists. This was their livelihood for the most part. They were at cons to sell art and socialize, often at art jams. That was the general rule with groups like Voodoo, and the same went for its successor APA, Rarbrazzle. But that meant funny animal fans who were either amateur artists or who didn't draw a lot, or just at all really, had no space of their own. That would all change starting in 1984, the turning point in anthro comics. I say that because besides Rarbrazzle being a thing the same year, that's when Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles and Steve Galacci's own comic anthology, Albedo Anthropomorphics, were published. If there wasn't that large of a crowd interested before, it was slowly getting there. And that crowd was well received in the parties held by Mark Merlino. He was out at WesterCon and SFCon back in 1985 when he hosted a pretty casual room party to show off animation and art for anyone interested. The thing that left the biggest impression on people was the tape of Animal Olympics playing on the TV, an animated Olympics special that Mark had saved and showed to various people. And it was a big hit, enough that at the same time, the same con next year, they held another party. It was from the same gathering in 1986 that we get the term furry as we know it now, and changed from the fan dynamic of semi-closed art jams to an open group of amateurs, readers, and writers, as well as artists. Well, kind of. Originally, there was a distinction between furry fans and furries. Furries were the characters, and were viewed by people like Mark the same way other media fans look at their characters. They're individuals in their own right, with a story to them. They're practically real in their minds. They're attractive. For furry fans, furries had just as much potential as any other character. Why wouldn't they? Pretty much every fur fan believed in that potential, but what made this fandom unique from the get-go was this. There is no canon. There is no single source of inspiration that is drawn upon, because it's like science fiction. It's a genre. Since most anthro material in the mainstream was being made for younger audiences, they either created fan art of that or made their own. Voodoo was doing original stuff from day one, no thanks to them being cartoonists, and that pretty much set the standard for people making not derivative works, but original ones. Why does this distinction matter? Well, no matter what kind of fan act you do, you're putting a bit of yourself in it. That's inherent to being a fan. But by making your own thing, that bit of yourself becomes more apparent. Groups like Voodoo viewed it as a medium for their kind of humor and satire. But by the time you get to the mishmash of different fans in the mid-'80s, they're taking an approach more like the Trek fans. The difference is that because the characters exist in whatever universe the fan wants, and because it's much more visual, it's usually art, remember, they started to draw characters that represented themselves, like an avatar. They weren't the first to do this. You can find early examples among Trek fans in writing, or the Voodoo crew in drawing, for example, but this was different. Creating a quote-unquote personal furry, as it was originally known, that was the term for a while, personal furry, look it up, was like self-caricature. This is Ken Sample's art, by the way, really good artist. It was you, but at the same time, not entirely. Whether it was a carbon copy in physique and mind, or entirely different, it gave people a way to tinker, to experiment. And it's not like everyone suddenly started referring to themselves as the characters they created, whether drawn by themselves or someone else, but now you had a tool. Now, you just needed somewhere to use it. That came in the form of online communications and the Bulletin Board Service, or BBS. A BBS, for those of you old enough to remember, was a way to dial into someone else's computer and read or leave messages, files, whatever. They were mostly used from the late 70s to the early 90s, when the internet gradually replaced them. It was a step up from APAs, since it sped up communications considerably, but computers were expensive. Most people couldn't afford one, or really needed one, but fans were one of the early adopters. The only limitation was long-distance calling, since that got expensive quick. This is all landlines, remember. So communities tended to be local or regional. Although they had something called FidoNet, essentially a series of relay stations that could transport messages across the country like a mail system, it could still take days for an email to travel from one coast to another. Oh, there we go. Thankfully for fur fans, though, the majority of them were on the West Coast, particularly the LA area. The earliest furry-related BBS was called The Tiger's Den, which got started in Mark's communal fan house back in 1983, the Prancing Skiltear. Which is actually, it's a pun on the Prancing Pony from Lord of the Rings, but anyway. But they were just using it to send emails. I mean, sorry, they weren't just using it to send emails. Jeez, I can't speak. The guy who ran the system, Andre, set it up with D&D in mind, but with a few differences. Instead of a combat system, the idea was you'd start with what was called a storyboard. 2 or more people would take turns writing a description in response to the last person. The system had been hacked where each individual user could log into multiple accounts, with each account representing a different character. So you could be role-playing as one person on one storyboard and someone else on another, and no one would know who you were. It didn't start out as an exclusively furry space, but once the parties got going, the numbers really started to ramp up. Anything you want to mention about this real quick?
Yes. Basically, Andre Johnson, one of my partners at the time, got really into BBSs because he wanted to trade software. But he found out quickly that the only way it worked is if you had something to trade. He didn't have anything. So he made a BBS, and with Ken Sample, our friend in New York City, who we'd have long phone conversations, he made a storyboard on the BBS so that Ken and him could play their characters at each other pretty much, and it caught on. So he took the old BBS software, which was called TNet, it was written by somebody else, and spent hours going over the code. It was written in BASIC. So first thing he did was he closed all the back doors, because most people who wrote BBS software wrote back doors so they could bring down a system if somebody stole their software.
Right.
It was the only way they could control it. So there were hackers, of course, we called them twinks back then, who would essentially discover all the back doors, and then go around and threaten BBSs and shut them down. So that's the first thing he did. The second thing he coded was he devised a way that people could run multiple characters off of a single, and the comments would come back to them, but nobody would know what the main account was.
Mm-hmm.
So this was kind of like what happened with Furry Muck and the Mucks and Muds years later. People could post as one or more characters, and nobody knew who they were.
Mm-hmm.
And this happened, we ended up with much more users making multiple characters for the storyboards.
Right.
This is probably a point where I should let Rodney talk about what happened to the main storyboard.
Okay.
Good morning, everybody.
Hey, Rod.
Hello. Thank you very much for putting this on, and I hope everybody is healthy and safe. Good to speak with you all. So, yeah, thank you. Mark was talking about the early storyboards and such. It's really difficult to explain in these days of, the Mucks are still around, and we've got Second Life and World of Warcraft and all that, and it's probably difficult for people to understand what it was like to be doing a fanish interaction where you would make a post and you were so jazzed if somebody responded to you within 1 week.
Yeah.
Talk about your lack. So, so I was involved with Mark in fandom since we met in 1980, and as Furry Fandom started getting up and rolling in the mid-1980s, and so did the BBSs at that time. And at that time, I had a story concept I was working on called Furla Dance. Furla Dance was a nightclub which was created by Recom Furries, Recombinant DNA, which were all the rage in Furry Fandom back in those days. For whatever reason. That's the same place that albedo characters that were around at the time.
Mm-hmm.
My concept was a nightclub for erotic dance, and it was different in that it was, well, for one thing, it was anthropomorphic animals doing the erotic dancing, and number two, it had equal parts male and female dancers, which was really unusual at the time. And that caught on as one of the first storyboard locations on the BBS. There was a part at the Furla Dance, which my characters were leading, but the word went out across the net, hey, we're having a special night. In the story concept, it was anthropomorphic characters dancing for a human audience. But this was a special party they were having, the concept went, where they were inviting other anthropomorphic characters to come visit. So that's when other people online started bringing up their own characters, or if they decided to be gutsy, playing well-known characters, and they all showed up together.
Nice. That's cool. Okay, nice. Something I should mention as well for people. This is dial-up communications we're talking about. So, only one person could be using the BBS at a time. You had to take turns. So if you're the Tiger's Den and you have almost 400 users at your peak, it'd take weeks to move a story along if enough people were involved. Okay, imagine if your Discord server could only be used by one person at a time. You would be sitting there hitting just trying to click on the icon for a while and eventually be like, oh shit, I actually got through. Pardon my French. But okay. So unfortunately, as far as I know, there aren't any archives for this particular BBS that survive. But we do know this, just in general. Online avatar creation, based on modern studies, does three things. It transfers design authority to the user, since you're the one making the character. It gives value to subjective and experimental knowledge, since the more you do it and make that character your own, the better you get at it. And it allows a theoretically infinite amount of users to use it in different contexts, because we're all going to approach character creation differently. These three things give you, the user, to quote from the study, control and a sense of freedom. And that's really the crux of what Furry Fandom would give. control. When you are a young person who identifies as LGBTQ, having that control is stupidly important in a society that ostracizes you. Having that anonymity in particular also gives people a layer of safety to explore their sexuality and identity because you're not going to experience the same stigma as you would in real life. It's a learning environment, and that's exactly what the Tiger's Den was for its users. I'm actually going to pull a quote from Mark here. Role-playing on text-based chat systems became a big thing for the early furry folks. Often it was here that the variations of gender expression and sexual activities were explored. Quite a few males decided to create female characters to get the most attention, which they often did, and discovered they didn't like it as much as they thought they would. It was the first place many people actually got a chance to experience what it was like to be a gender different from what they were in RL. Like, think about that for a second. Like, if you're transgender, this is something that people I've often used, I've heard in this community, myself included, to figure out what your gender is, like just who you are as a person, because of that ability to experiment. Also, that's not even getting into the fact, by the way, that Mark and his partner, Rod, were both openly bisexual during this time, in the 1980s. So right off the bat, two key organizers of this burgeoning fandom were more accepting of LGBT fans. By being open about their relationship, they felt they sent out a signal to other people who weren't necessarily out. It was a sign that this was a safe space for them. It shouldn't be surprising, like Rod just mentioned, that he started that furry nightclub, Furla Dance, with dancers and everything. So, but the other thing is, though, you didn't just see this online. New fanzines were being created for party attendees, most notable being Furversion. With a lot of similarities to Trek fandom, you had art and fiction prominently displayed with some of it erotic. And, just like in Trek and in Voodoo for that matter, there was opposition to drawing what some called slime. Rob Rousel ended up banning anything explicit, and during a party at BayCon in 1989, the infamous, and pardon my French here, this is like web 1 or 2 swears, Skunk Fuckers rehabilitation posters were posted up in the convention center. Interestingly enough, there was no evidence that this animosity came from SF fans, and you'd be surprised to hear that the con chair of BayCon actually took the side of the furry partygoers, since she refused to blacklist people for something that she considered a minor annoyance at best. But there had already been a different kind of motivation prior to this for fur fans to get their own space. Basically, parties were held at SF or Comic-Cons, and those were the only ways you could meet people in person that weren't local. The other problem was the ever-increasing amount of fans. Hotel rooms can only hold so many people, as many of us know, so there's really only one response. Start your own con. Of course, they weren't sure if people were going to show up, so they called it their first run, like a test run, basically. And in January of 1989, they had Conference Zero. Also, spoilers, there was plenty of interest. I want to say, 52 people showed up, but 100 said they were interested. Can you confirm me on that?
Yes, it was. I think we eventually thought there were about between 52 and 65 people at Conference Zero. 65, Rodney confirms. 2 fursuits, one of them including Hilda the Bambioid, who actually did a little dance number and teased various people in the audience who came up on stage with her. So that was kind of like almost a forward dance became at our conventions in later years.
Gotcha. Right. Okay. Yeah. I just
we had an art display, not an art show. We displayed furry art. None of it was for sale. And I think there might have been 2 people who had tables that may have been selling stuff, but it was a tiny convention. People showed up.
Nice. Yeah, there was interest. And they ran things a bit differently than the SF cons. The art shows were much bigger and deemed more central to the convention experience. The Fursuit Parade was invented for the sake of convenience, of all things, and instead of panels, they had round table discussions, which you still see at some cons today. What ended up being the biggest change didn't actually originate in the con space itself. It was how they took in a large number of newcomers coming from online, specifically a new service that you might have heard of called Furry Muck. Oh, here we go. There it goes. A bit of background on this. A MUD, or multi-user dungeon, is basically online D&D from the BBS era. A muck is a derivation of a mud since it removes combat in favor of a social environment. But the difference is that mucks made use of a new kind of tech, already in use on university campuses where it became publicly available in 1989. The internet. Now you no longer had to dial into someone else's computer. You could just get on a dedicated server that could support multiple users at one time, in real time. The creators of this muck wanted to unite the high-speed roleplay crowd with the congoers, who were already toying with the idea of a personal furry, something which came to be called a fursona. So the online environment didn't create the concept of a fursona. Instead, it acted as the catalyst that allowed the concept to thrive. The result? A new kind of fan-act done by a much larger and different population of fans than the ones from the con space. And yes, it did bring in, It did bring in a significant amount of new people. If Trek had young college-age women in the 70s, Furry had young college-age men in the 90s. Why college-age? Logistics. They had access to computer terminals. As a result of being students, though in some cases you could get an account through your own university, even if you weren't a student, they weren't full computers, but instead they were portals that gave them access to a larger server. And for these young fur fans, this was their creative and personal outlet. The concept of furries as individual characters, and attractive ones at that, went hand in hand with tailoring an avatar, having an online roleplay experience they could immerse themselves in, and having a means to explore what exactly their sexuality was, just who they were. It made it a hell of a lot easier not only to find stuff like Slash, but also experience it. However, unlike the people who had been congoers for decades, in some cases, these fans were feral, quote-unquote, which is kind of a funny term since we're talking about furries, but that's the fan term. All that meant is that they were introduced to fandom without any sort of guidance by anyone else to say what the ground rules are. Because fandom is a society, and we live in a society, there are general expectations and practices that differ between each one. Before the internet and mucks, and the BBSs for that matter, you only had cons, which limited the funny animal crowd to science fiction, fantasy, gaming, and comics artists, plus their fans. With this new way of reaching people, you're suddenly bringing in a population that was either unaware of fandom or simply didn't have access to it. After all, college students aren't exactly known for having a lot of money. Oftentimes, the best they can hope for is to stay in touch online. That's why this con in particular has been so successful and why there's so many new people here. Like, that's something I noticed immediately when I got into here. But imagine having this kind of situation 30 years ago, when only a handful of people were even aware of the internet. I didn't even know there were local furs near me until I found them by accident 4 years ago. So when Mark and Rod heard about this new crowd, they were like, hell yeah, let's tell them about our con. Even though these people weren't steeped in the norms of fandom, that's not what the organizers cared about. All they were looking for were people who they could hang out with for a weekend. So the result was an influx of younger fans, particularly young gay and bisexual men, with no experience in con culture, entering real-life fandom for the first time and finally meeting their friends and or significant others face to face. And just as they had learned to explore themselves online, they also did so in the con space. Hence, why you had people complaining to Mark and Rod that they were at fault for encouraging quote-unquote alternative lifestyles, or otherwise complaining that the newcomers were overly sexual or focused on erotic art. But no one person could have seen this coming. And this is why you have to understand general fan history. It's all this buildup of fan culture, norms, and expectations towards characters, combined with a sudden influx of new people coming from an online space that passively encourages identity exploration. It's a complete mess of factors. And it's no wonder that people at the time, and to this day, have tried to find a simple answer. Oh, it was the organizers' fault. Oh, they're just sexual deviants and pervs looking for smut. Yeah. Those are much easier to process than a mountain of information and culture taking place over literal decades. And no one certainly could have seen this unusual but overall quite positive culture forming in the way it has. By the way, this next part is an addendum to the larger paper I actually wrote, since I didn't really go over the 2010s originally, but enough people have asked about it that I figured it might be at least good to mention a few things. When I was going through Wikifur one time, I saw someone refer to the 2000s as the quote-unquote dark ages. While I sort of understand what they were going for, that's a pretty misleading term. What they're getting at is that furry fandom was no longer an unknown. The stereotypes were no longer limited to furries or even other fans. It was now public knowledge, and now they had to face the wrath of public perception, especially where the internet was concerned. The only other specific community at this time that also got a bad rap was the Trek community, and that was focused on more extreme examples of fannish behavior. For furries, the spotlight was put on how open and honest they were about their sexuality. The relative number of LGBTQ people in furry fandom was already much higher than the average population by like 2,000. So it's something that even in the late 90s that was construed as deviant or abnormal. That and fursuits were an easy visual marker for the furry stereotype, even though at most, about a fifth, even today, actually own a fursuit. The battle that had been raging on the Usenet boards was more or less usurped by Vanity Fair's extremely misleading article, the skits done by Saturday Night Live, or whatever other talk show host wanted to take a crack at the new joke on the block. So it's really misleading to characterize this period as some kind of dark age, though, because it implies that there wasn't much going on, or that furries were just hiding under their beds. The worst that came out of this increased public attention was people saying, well, I wasn't really planning on telling my coworkers what I do on the weekends, but now I'm definitely not telling them what I do on the weekends. These were also often people who weren't publicly out about their sexuality either. Remember that, because that could be also be detrimental to their jobs. Hence, the online space and comms served double duty as places they could be open about it. And the debate over adult content and behavior came to a head with the burn furs. From the late 90s to the early 2000s, they were adamant about cleaning up the fandom's image, which they believed could only be achieved with less overt erotic art and behavior. The problem with the burn furs came from their leadership especially. Much of it was very homophobic, which certainly didn't help their popularity in a community with relatively high LGBT representation. And while the debate has continued to this very day, in recent years it's become less about sexuality and more about consent and where and when it's appropriate. The main takeaway from the double aughts was the rapid growth of the online community, and no thanks to the small part to the internet's explosive growth, and also of furcons in the US and globally, both in size and number. Anthrocon, Further Confusion, Megaplex, Meffet Fur Meet, Midwest Furfest, Confuzzled. We went from a handful, literally maybe 2 or 3, to double digits really quickly. In the online realm, Internet relay chats, or IRCs, gradually replaced the older Usenet boards by the early 2000s, meaning that furs were able to chat in real time beyond spaces like Furry Muck. Before the advent of things like Twitter or Facebook, this is what you had to work with. Telegram and Discord didn't even become known names until 2015, so prior to that, IRCs were still one of the main ways fans found each other and talked in large numbers. I'm not talking about instant messaging services or specialty sites like DeviantArt, fanfiction.net, or even fandom-specific forums. And because honestly, it's surprising how new of a concept server-based instant communication is. But there you go. So what about the 2010s? How can we best describe what happened this decade? 2 main things. Zootopia and Beastars. I'm kidding. 2 main things. A change in demographics and a change in culture. Not just furry culture, but American culture. The demographic change comes mostly from social media. While the average age of furries first getting into fandom was already pretty young, being late teens to early 20s, with the advent of sites like Twitter, Instagram, and Tumblr, rest in peace Tumblr, that pushed the demographic even further back to the early teens. You're talking about 13-year-olds starting off with Warriors OCs that eventually bled into the larger furry fandom within a few years, where before you'd be 15 to 16 were even heard of the term furry. The average con-goer today is still in their early to mid-20s, if not older, but since a decent majority of furries haven't even been to a convention, maybe a most regional one that wasn't even necessarily furry, that demographic shift has become pretty apparent. Not to mention that this new crowd has a whole new attitude when it comes to their identity. I can't even tell you how much change I've seen in the last 5 years when it comes to young people being loud and proud about not just being a furry, but also their sexuality and their gender identity as well. That ties into the other change, which is, like I said, a larger cultural shift. Not only was gay marriage finally legalized in 2015, you also had transgender people enter the larger public consciousness with people like Chelsea Manning. You can also see a few things happening here. furries coming out on their sexuality, gender, and their fan identity, but also a decrease in the stigmatization of furries as a whole. Take news articles as an example. The number of articles that have been critical or mocking of furries was significantly less in the 2010s than it was in the 2000s. Compared to the previous decade's Vanity Fair, CSI episode, Dr. Phil, buttloads of news reports, compared to this decade's CNN short documentary on the fandom, the consistently positive reports by the Pittsburgh Post-Gazette, and of course, Ash Coyote's new documentary set to release later this year, which I definitely recommend you go see. You can attribute this partly to mocking furries getting old hat, but also due to the fact that making fun of furries for being so LGBT positive doesn't have the same weight anymore. With the mainstreaming of LGBT visibility, less ammo can be expended against furries for those reasons alone, which actually goes to show how much the LGBT element led to furry hate in the first place. Not all, mind you. There's also the othering element that's intrinsic to being a fan, but it at least explains somewhat why furries have gotten an especially bad rap in the past. So here we are, 50 years on. Where we go from here is hard to say, and even though our inspirations will change and the exact ways we socialize and communicate might differ, the fascination with anthro characters will definitely be sticking around for a long time. Thank you all so much for coming. That's been the panel. If any of you have any questions for me or for my friends present on the voice chat, just let us know. We'll be sticking around here for a little bit, and we'll also be on Discord if you want to talk there. We also have a voice channel and a text channel set up.
Yes, I'm here, and my partner Rodney is here to take any questions.
All right, we'll see what we get.
Is there a voice chat for this channel too?
On the actual server, there is a voice chat. Yes, so we actually hop on there later, or in a minute really, if people want to do that.
Okay, but it's not concurrent with the YouTube thing.
I'll probably do it after the YouTube thing. Okay, we have a question from 99122. How did the fandom spread from the U.S. to other territories?
Yeah, lots.
Really, it was mostly the same way that fandom spread with any other group, really. It was just communications between other fans, and also, I think with furry in particular, because it's a global thing, because of the internet. The internet is not just restricted to a regional place like the BBSs were. You could have internet access almost anywhere. It also probably helped that Mark and Rod, you were probably also traveling to the UK as well, if I remember correctly. So you're probably talking with people there and sharing this, hosting parties.
Yeah, I wanted to answer Shall Music FX's question. The biggest challenge when we decided to actually start doing a convention was we had to go to a hotel with no business account and basically ask them to provide us with function space. And of course, that wasn't free. That cost money. So the first couple of conventions, Rodney and I basically pooled our extra money and rented the convention rooms. We didn't have anyone guaranteeing to fly in and sleep in the hotel, so we couldn't use hotel rooms as leverage to pay for function space. That happened many years later.
Okay. Yeah, because dealing with the hotel is definitely one of the harder parts of running a con, and just in general.
I think it's interesting that in the years that Rodney and I ran conference, we had no issues whatsoever with the venues, with the exception of Conference 10. Even with people trying to sabotage the convention by calling the hotel and lying to them about things.
Mm-hmm.
Every hotel we had one convention in begged us to come back. And the only reason we kept changing hotels is we kept running out of function space.
Right, yeah.
We found out very early on, and this is something that's haunted furry conventions ever since, is if you're in a facility that's large enough that they're going to have other events going on during your convention, there will always be uncomfortable clashes.
Mm-hmm.
So the trick back then was to find a hotel that had just enough function space that we would take over the entire hotel for our weekend.
Right, yeah.
Back then, the art shows were huge. We had more artists and more art on display at a furry convention with 500 people than a world science fiction convention had.
Mm-hmm. Which is pretty
It
good.
was literally, Furry Fandom was all about art back then.
Mm-hmm. Nice. Let's see what other questions I can answer here. How is violence? Post their YouTube channels. I'll go ahead and post the Prancing Scale Tearers YouTube channel in the Discord as well. Just so you all can go see the stuff that they've posted, since there's some pretty cool stuff. Was there ever an oh-shit moment where you realized this was going to be a way bigger than you thought, or was it apparent from the beginning that there was exponential growth? That would be more a question for you, to be honest.
Yeah, actually, it was surprising. It really was. When we started out, we were looking to find more people that were into the same thing we were, mainly animal characters in anything. And the room parties we had were specifically designed to attract people. That's why we had artwork to look at, why we showed shows like Animal Olympics, Warner Brothers cartoons, which you couldn't actually see on television uncut at the time, and we had, basically taped from collectors.
Okay.
Essentially, we went to our first Midwest Fur Fest in December. And on Thursday night, walking into the Hyatt lobby and seeing 2,000 furries in the lobby, which is 4 stories tall, was mind-boggling.
Yeah,
it
no
just
kidding.
was amazing.
MFF is insane. It's just crazy. I can't even believe how many people go to that.
But they're very good at still making it feel comfortable. They have all these meeting areas where you can grab a table with your friends. They have a 24/7 con suite with free food and all the free soda you can guzzle. The hotel provides inexpensive lunches. They haven't missed the fact that when you're at a furry convention, you're pretty much in a different world, and you're going to live there for several days.
Right.
And they really know how to make you feel comfortable. So people who go, well, it's too big for me, it really isn't. Try it. You'll like it.
No, seriously. I mean, and this is just to go out to everyone. If you ever get the chance, definitely check out a con sometime, because it is such a worthwhile experience. I mean, you get to meet so many new people. You get to go to panels, not just like this, but also like fun ones like where they're like game shows, or we can go to ones where it's like talking about how to make fursuits and just all sorts of really cool stuff. And it doesn't have to be a huge one. It doesn't have to be MFF. Like, you could go to BOFC, you could go to, I don't know, Fur Squared or something like that. Just something small, and you could still have a really fun time. So, I would definitely say that.
A Savage Cloud asked what age group
where most people were when Furry Fandom was just starting to get popular.
Okay, essentially, back then it was science fiction fans who were generally older than 20, and people from the CFO who were younger than, who were in their 50s to, 18, maybe 17 years old.
Mm-hmm.
But it was mostly middle-aged people who had been science fiction fans for many years.
Mm-hmm.
it didn't actually, the younger demographic didn't actually happen until Conference 3, which is when Rodney and I promoted the convention heavily on Furry Muck.
Mm-hmm.
And a lot of the Furry Muckers showed up. We even passed out little name badges that said, "Hi, I'm virtually."
Right, yeah.
And you could put your handle in there.
Mm-hmm.
So it's funny, there's an event called the September That Never Ended.
Yep.
Which is when AOL and the other exclusively closed social networks suddenly opened their populations up to the actual internet.
Mm-hmm.
And the reference comes from, there was always a huge influx of new people on online services every September when freshmen started out at college.
Right.
So there was this whole influx of newbies that people had to deal with, and people had to learn. Like you said, they were ferals. They were basically feral online furries that had to learn the etiquette and the rules and all that kind of stuff.
Right.
Every September.
Mm-hmm.
Well, after all of the subscription services that were selling bits and pieces of the internet, by minute to people, after they all decided to open up the gates, the flood, the September never ended.
Right, exactly. It just kept going. They just kept showing
And
up.
in the case of Furry Cons, we actually beat it by 1 year.
Oh, damn.
Conference 3, we had all the Furry Muckers showing up.
Mm.
And we invited the Furry to be guests. And the following year was when the September That Never Ended happened.
Right.
That would have been Conference 4. And as you mentioned the influx of all these new fans aren't familiar with any other fandom except the audiences and being furries, did cause some friction.
Right, they just
with
weren't
the
familiar
established
with... Yeah. And so, and that's definitely something that's important to remember whenever you do think about furry history a bit, is because it wasn't constant. You had a shift that happened where it wasn't always like it is today, And so that's probably one of the big reasons why I did this in the first place, to be honest, because it's important to recognize that it's not always something you take for granted. There's a reason it's a thing, But that's just me talking as a historian. Does anybody else have any other questions? I mean, if not, we can always all move to the Discord server. Like I said, if you go to the panels section at the bottom, it should be called, just the section is called panels, and there's a hashtag called Brief History of Furry Fandom. If you all want to talk there, and I'll maybe even talk in the panel overflow if you want to actually talk with us, I'll just be hanging out there for a little bit, and we can just chat for a bit and see if you have any other questions, and just do that for a while, to be honest, and maybe we'll go check out some other panels. So, don't think there's anything else. Give it about 30 seconds. It's kind of a delay. Yeah, thank you very much, Jasper, for being here. A link to the server, I mean, if you're not already on the server, let me see if I can actually find the link for it real quick. Cool. Yeah, I was going to say, if you go to RAMCon's Twitter page, you'll be able to find a link to the server right on the top, so... Yeah, thank you all very much, seriously. I mean, I'm really glad that there was such a good turnout to this panel, and I really hope you all learn this and just keep reading, like keep learning about this stuff, because there's so much cool stuff, not only just in terms of like what people were doing, but also just how much stuff there is for like from the 80s, for example. Like read, like check out Albedo sometime or something like that, because it's a really cool comic and one of like the ones that people were originally reading to get into this thing in the first place. So once again, I'll go ahead and end the stream here, and I will see you all on the Discord. Peace out.